ارغوان شاخه هم خونه جدا مانده من آسمان تو چه رنگ است امروز آفتابیست هوا یا گرفته است هنوز من در این گوشه که از دنیا بیرون است آسمانی.
Good morning, I'm Jim Perkins, and I welcome you to the second presentation in the Spring 2013 OLLI Program Series, Foreign Cultures and American Foreign Policy. The objective of this OLLI program is to inform participants about foreign cultures and how they affect these countries' behavior and how that knowledge can create an enlightened American foreign policy. Today's presentation is Iranian Women, a modernizing force by Professor Farzaneh Milani. A reminder that we will have a question and answer session at the conclusion of Professor Milani's presentation, and we'll use those microphones over here at the side, so please queue up there and step up close. Today we are privileged to have with us a distinguished international figure speaking on a topic near and dear to her heart about Iranian women. Her talk is titled Iranian Women, a Moderating and Modernizing Force. Farzaneh Milani is professor and chair of the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asia Languages and Cultures at the University of Virginia. Professor Milani received her BA degree from California State University of Hayward, transferring to the University of California in Los Angeles, and she completed her graduate studies in comparative literature in 1979 and taught Persian language and literature at UCLA for 4 years before coming here to the University of Virginia in 1986. She is the past president of the Association of Middle Eastern Women Studies in America, and Milani was the recipient of the Alumni Teaching Award in 1998. Born and raised in Tehran and educated in French and American schools, Milani used the lens of poetry, literature, and film to argue in her book, Veils and Swords, that Iranian women's true struggle is not against the veil, but for freedom of movement, the ability to choose where to go. She and her husband came to the United States in December of 1967. Last year, in 2012, Professor Milani authored the book Words Not Swords, Iranian Women Writers and the Freedom of Movement. This book challenges what she sees as the narrow Western stereotype of the shrouded, oppressed Muslim woman who is captive of her faith and her veil. Also in 2012, she was named Woman of the Year by the Iranian Women's Studies Foundation at the group's annual conference in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Here are some descriptions by others of how they see Farzaneh Milani. A friend states, "She brings a perspective to this country of the knowledge, wisdom, and experience born of growing up in a different culture." And Meredith Jung-En Woo, who is the Dean of Arts and Sciences at UVA, has said about Professor Milani, "She is truly a bilingual person and a bicultural person. She really understands the worldview of the others and has a complex two-way understanding of how cultures truly work." On a personal note, Professor Milani is again a proud grandmother. Her new grandson, Marco, was born last week. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Farzaneh Milani. Thank you. Thank you, dear. You're welcome.
So sweet. Thank you, sir. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Jim, for such an eloquent and generous introduction. You honor me with your words. Thank you. And I want to thank you all for being here on such a beautiful day. It's hard to be scooped in here. So you really, truly honor me with your presence here and with the chance to share with you some thoughts on Iranian women. Please allow me to begin with a disclaimer. I don't understand politics. I'm not a political scientist. And I have never been interested in politics. I love literature. I love poetry. Having said that, I want to tell you, I am consistently baffled by our politicians, by the media, by politicians not only outside of Iran, but also inside, to neglect literature as a source for better understanding the culture, the people, and most importantly, what is most important about politics. So today, with no claims to help you better understand American foreign policy towards Iran, I will try to share with you what I have learned for almost 4 decades as a student of Iranian women. I have studied Iranian women for almost 4 decades. Other than my family, I think I have done nothing else that is more important and more meaningful in my life. I have learned a great deal from women writers in Iran, since my field is literature. And more, as I have aged and gotten older and older and older, I have also learned that they have a lot to tell us about Iranian politics. And 2, that they have been at the forefront of a modernizing movement inside of my country of birth, Iran. So let me start with this wonderful quotation that I read very recently by President Carter. After at least 33 years after the hostage crisis, of hearing about Iran as a violent country, as hostage takers, as a country that oppresses its women, as Islam being the faith that shrouds women in their veils and doesn't allow them freedom of anything, I was truly surprised and delighted to see this in an article published by President Carter. He says, we need to challenge these self-serving and outdated attitudes and practices as we are seeing in Iran. I mean, the example he uses is Iran, where women are at the forefront of the battle for democracy and freedom. I agree with President Carter. For at least the last 25 years, I have written, I am on record for having said that. And if you would allow me not to be humble, I said that at a time when nobody believed it. So let's start this journey. How did it come about? How did this come about? I don't think women were always at the forefront of a battle for democracy, for human rights, and for human dignity in Iran. I will present to you today and hopefully convince you that this desire to change the country for better, their country for better, started in Iran by women about 160 years ago. So we will, in the next 40, 50 minutes that I will be presenting to you, talk about that, and hopefully in Q&A we will engage each other in a dialogue, and I very much look forward to that. I want to suggest to you that in the modern history of Iran, we always talk about two revolutions. The constitutional revolution of 1905, 1907, which was a very important revolution. For the first time, Iranians argued for a parliamentarian kind of government. They rejected absolutist, royalist form of government. And then, of course, the one we all know a lot about is the 1979 revolution, which originally was not necessarily called Islamic Revolution, but a number of events, in particular the hostage crisis and the war with Iraq, clinched it as the Islamic Revolution. Many different sectors of the society, from the ultra-left to the ultra-right, and Iran is a very heterogeneous society, were involved in that revolution, but the revolution ended up being an Islamic revolution. I want to present to you that not only two revolutions happened in the last 100 years, 140, 50, 60 years in Iran, but that there is a third revolution. Not too many people talk about it. It does not coincide with traditional definitions of a revolution, but I hope I will be able to convince you that in fact it has changed the society by far more than the two other revolutions. It has restructured the very foundation of the Iranian society. That revolution is a women's revolution. And by that, I don't mean to exclude men. I am, with great pride, a feminist, but I'm the kind of feminist who don't believe in enmity between the genders. I have studied women pioneers in Iran enough to know that every single one of them relied on the support, on the goodwill, on the kindness and generosity of soul and egalitarian perspective of a man. So when I say a women's revolution, I will explain that I only mean that women helped to desegregate a segregated society in Iran. Now, most of my argument is going to revolve around literary women, although I'm going to try to talk about literature and society at the same time, because I don't see them as differently. In a recent, very recent talk to a group of writers in Iran, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, warned his audience, writers, that they better follow the moral code of the Islamic Republic. He proceeded to then say, as the only example he used, the iconic Iranian women poet, Forough Farrokhzad, who had passed away in 1967 at the age of 32 in a car accident, as an exemplary counter-ideal. And he said that her early death was her saving grace, and in a way also ours. Understood in that statement is that what we might ask is so dangerous about a woman poet who died at the age of 32, almost 50 years ago. A couple of years before that lecture, in 2010, another iconic Iranian woman, also a poet, Simin Behbahani, who is still alive and in Iran, in her mid-80s, a voice of wisdom and non-violence, and a fantastic poet, was stopped at the airport. Her valid passport was confiscated, and after being questioned all night long, she was sent home without her passport. Since then, she has become literally a prisoner in her own country, with her passport confiscated. She cannot leave the country. What, we might ask, is so dangerous about a woman who has always believed in the power of words, who has never believed in violence, who has in fact systematically for over 60 years, that's how long she's been writing poetry, has argued against violence. This is one of my favorite poems of her. It's much more beautiful in Persian than in my translation. My poems are my sword. They are mightier than any sword. Though they can cut deep, and she knows that words can cut deep, my fine weapon is not for bloodshed. Well, there is a reason the supreme leader of Iran singles out a woman poet, and the government singles out another woman poet to be talked about as the counter-ideal woman, to be literally put under, to be banned in their own countries. And Prof. was banned immediately after the revolution, although she has become now even more popular than she's ever been, and her books are being published now in Iran. And Simin Behbahani is alive and well and living inside the country as a voice of dissent. Well, the Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Iran, knows what has happened in Iran in the last 160 years, but in particular after the revolution. So let me share with you some statistics that might puzzle you. Look at the literacy rate. 1976, just a couple of years before the revolution, women's literacy rate was almost 48%. Right now, it's 80%. And of course, you know that it's going to be a lot more among younger generation. That's in the whole country. Share of university population, women. 1976, at the height of modernizing Iran, what the Shah called also westernizing Iran, 30%. In 2011, and I have relied for all my statistics on non-Iranian sources for a variety of reasons, but 64% of all students admitted to institutions of higher education in Iran were women. That means only 36% were men. Iran, I believe, is the only country in the world that is talking about affirmative action for men. They are. They've been discussing it in the parliament for good reason. Of course, they claim that the reason they're so concerned is because these women need husbands. We're worried about that. But for whatever reason, 64% of women in our universities are women. Look at average number of children, and that the Islamic Republic has to be truly recognized as having done the impossible. We went from 7.2 to 1.86. They have been commended for that. And the average age of marriage, the most recent one that I could find, 2012, is 24.2. Now, you have read, I'm sure, lots of books, lots of bestsellers about Iranian women and how the Islamic Republic lowered the age of marriage to 9, which they did. That part is true. But people did not follow. The average age of marriage has never been that high in Iran for women as it is now. Look at the role of women in cyberspace. It is truly mind-boggling. Look at the statistics. First of all, Iran is, we have at least 23 million users of the internet. And the green movement of 2009, I'm sure you remember, the media and social media had an amazing importance in that. And look at the growth, 7,100% growth in users. Iran is the fastest growing user of the internet. And what is truly fascinating is the preponderance of women bloggers, women who are writing some of the most intimate stories of their lives. Some very devout, women who are practicing Muslims, whose husbands are now, for one reason or another, in prison, are writing and publishing their love letters to their husbands. And in a minute, I will tell you how significant that is. I believe cyberspace is a form of desegregation for women who come from segregated societies. And look at these two wonderful quotes. My weblog is my trench. My thoughts are my rifle. And my writings are my bullets. You might not like the use of the analogy of war in all of that, but it's a reminder that we can do the same through words, through nonviolence. And this other one by Saeedeh Pakrawan, a wonderful writer, who says, a blog gives me the perfect tool. I can stand tall on the parapets of my personal fortress, see old and new enemies of reason, wisdom, or logic, and send out my own arrows as counter-arguments. And indeed, she's a blogger and she's doing that, also a wonderful writer. Now, there has been a renaissance in Iranian women's literature. after the revolution. I call it a collateral benefit of the Islamic revolution. Without going into issues of cause and effect, I can tell you with certainty that a revolution, that a renaissance has happened in women's literature in Iran. I'm going to give you some statistics in a minute, but I want to tell you that that renaissance has democratized women's writing in Iran. It has democratized the social status, the social class of women writers. Women writers no longer come from only the aristocracy, the high aristocracy or the court, as they did for a long time. There are now minority women, Jewish women, Christian women, even Baha'i women who have truly been oppressed in Iran after the Islamic Revolution in particular, who are becoming bestsellers. So I see that as another form of democratization. Family connections. In the early years of women writers in Iran, the overwhelming majority of them were connected closely to a man writer, a man who was in the publishing industry. This is no longer the case. And education. Previously, the overwhelming majority of our women writers before the revolution were highly educated. Not only they came from elite classes, not only the overwhelming majority were Muslims, but they also had higher education. Many of them were also westernized, and I'm using it in a very positive sense. That's not the case anymore. That has changed. So let's look at some puzzling statistics. In the 1960s, we only had a handful of women writers in Iran, women poets, and especially women novelists. This is about women novelists. In 1999, we had less than 30. And now, we have almost 370 women novelists in Iran. This is almost equal to the number of men who are writing inside the country. Women translators, you see the same amazing jump. Women working in publishing industry, number of women publishers, and you know how important that is. To recognize women's issues as important, not as secondary or unimportant. Women publishers have been really instrumental in publishing the work of other women writers. And number of books sold. The average book print in Iran these days is about 5,000. The population of Iran is a little less than 80 million now. Some of our women writers are publishing books and selling over 100,000 copies. Unprecedented, almost, in the history of women's literature in Iran. Now, to come back to the issue of how these women have changed the society they live in, and how thematically they have revolutionized the dominant discourse in their country. I have chosen the most three important themes that I think is cause for celebration. Freedom of movement, and in a minute I will talk about the significance of that. changing the infrastructure of the Iranian society. I will present to you that Iranian women writers have redefined, restructured, and changed the family unit in Iran. And I believe you cannot have a democratic society if you don't have a democratic family. The basis of democracy, of human rights, of human dignity, the site of it is inside the home. That's where we learn, that's where we practice, and that's where it eventually turns into a sign, a symbol of the larger democracy in the country. So I'm going to take these each separately and take a few minutes of your time and discuss each of them. What do I mean by freedom of movement? Although Islam in its core teaching, at least as I understand it, never advocated segregation of men and women, for centuries, after the golden years of Islam, and my personal belief is that one reason we declined is exactly because we segregated women, one of the main reasons. Although Islam never advocated segregating women, successive generations of male theologians advocated and practiced and literally imprisoned women. For centuries, women in Muslim majority countries were confined to private spaces. There are different definitions for privacy, for private and public. But however it's defined in different countries, women were denied their freedom of movement. In a sex-segregated society, the access of men and women to each other remains the same. But what is different in a sex-segregated society is that whereas men are free to move about, to go anywhere they wish, women are not. You know, let me try to put this in a global context, and then I will come back to Iran and the Islamic faith. I just want to acknowledge that this is not the monopoly of either my country of birth, Iran, or of my faith, Islam. That it happens in all societies that I know, although to different degrees and through different methods. Look at the sign of masculinity and femininity. The woman is held in place in a handheld mirror. Significance of looks, of focusing on the body. Look at the symbol of men, and these are universal signs and symbols of masculinity and femininity. The sky is the limit. The man is free to reach for the stars. Foot binding in China. For almost 1,000 years, women had their feet bound in China. What does that do other than to restrict and control your freedom of movement? I know foot binding is much more complicated than that, but one of the reasons foot binding lasted so long is because it controlled women. It started with women dancers who wanted to have more freedom, who wanted to be more agile. Bound feet, in a funny way, resembles toe shoes in many ways. So like ballerinas, originally, women who started binding their feet wanted to be better dancers, more agile, but it evolved into something completely different. Look at Cinderella. What do we know about Cinderella other than her tiny little feet? The reason Cinderella went from rags to riches was because she had the smallest feet in the country. There are almost 600 different variants of this most popular fairy tale in the world. The oldest written version comes from China, congruent with the beginning of foot binding. Should we say that Cinderella perhaps had her feet bound? Why go all the way back to Cinderella and thousands of years ago? What about Barbie? The ideal of modern beauty and femininity. The most popular toy ever created. Her feet, I'm sure you have noticed, are bound. Everything has changed, almost everything has changed about Barbie. The color of her hair, her clothing, her hair, her complexion. Those small, tiny little feet have never changed. Barbie is on tiptoe. Barbie has the feet of a 4 or 5 year toddler. I've done the calculation. She's a tall woman, unlike me. I think half of her weight is in her breasts. But her feet are tiny. She can never stand on her own feet. And language is so wise all the time. Just quickly, what about the counter-ideal women? What about witches? Not only in the West, in the East, I think it's more or less a global phenomenon. Sure, witches are old and wrinkly, and we don't look at them as the source of wisdom, of experience, as we did in my culture. Old age was respected, was the height of what one could reach in a life. But for whatever reason, they're asymmetrical, they have big feet, they have flat feet. But most importantly, what is about witches that makes them so despised? It's their mobility. The very sign and symbol of their domesticity, their broom, is turned into a vehicle, able to carry them to forbidden places. Their broom becomes their bicycles, their motorcycles, their cars. I have a lot of examples to give you about this notion of freedom of movement, the aestheticization of immobility in women. Let me give you another example from literature, the erotics of immobility. All the sleeping beauties. Prince Charming is on his horse galloping, and the ideal woman is sleeping, or better yet, sometimes even dead. Things are changing. Here's Wonder Woman flying and talking about how it comes naturally to her and it's old. and even for women in the Middle East. I have lots of problems with the movie Aladdin, but I have to say it's a very smart film, and Disney has done a great job. The reason Jasmine, I don't know how many of you have watched that wonderful film. I have political problems with it, but it's a great film. The reason Jasmine chooses Aladdin is for no other reason than he can offer her freedom of movement. With his magic carpet, he's going to take her on a tour of the sky. He's going to turn her literally into a bird. So let me go back to Iran. I hope I have managed at least to convince you that freedom of movement, that women have had their freedom of movement constrained in all the societies that I know to different degrees. I want to say one last thing. Modernity was congruent with valuing mobility. Article 13 of the Declaration of Human Rights tells us that freedom of movement is the right of every individual. Michel Foucault, the wonderful French philosopher, has argued that prison as a dominant form of punishment began with modernity. Prisoners have most of the rights we do, but they're denied their freedom of movement. They're not allowed to leave the prison whenever they wish. So segregation, denying women that right, denies them a lot of their rights. And that's what has happened in many of the Muslim majority countries in the last few decades, and it started to change 160 years ago. And so let me quickly talk about, how much more time do I have?
We have as much time as you want. We can take up to 12:30 if you want. It's a
Okay.
quarter till, so we have another 15, 20 minutes.
Okay. I just also wanted to talk about how women have democratized the family unit. The minute a woman picks up the pen and starts writing, that act of writing is almost a magic carpet. It takes her voice all over the world, to different places. So it's not surprising that in the treasure trove of Persian literature, and I might be biased, but I truly believe Persian literature is one of for the most part, undiscovered treasures of world literature. You know, we know about Hafez and Rumi, thank God, he's the best-selling author. He sells, I've heard, even more than Shakespeare in the US. We've heard about Ferdowsi, but Persian modern literature, for the most part, remains undiscovered in the world, and it is a treasure trove. Women, for the most part, were denied access to the publishing world in Iran. We have women poets going back to the very beginning of Persian literature, the written form, which is over 1,000 years old. But those women are exceptions. They're sporadic examples. It is only in the mid-19th century that we started having a tradition of women writers, where you had successive generations of women writers referring to each other, learning from one another, gaining strength from one another. What they did was to redefine masculinity and femininity. Femininity was no longer synonymous with immobility. Femininity was no longer synonymous with silence. And masculinity was no longer synonymous with being a breadwinner. So gender relations, the relations between men and women within this most important unit of the society, was thus changed. So masculinity was defined, femininity was defined, gender relations were defined. And for the first time, Iranian men were unveiled in Persian literature. There is justice in the universe. You veil your women, then you're going to be veiled in the literature. We didn't have enough women writers to present men as the beloved, as the object of their love and lust and desire. It's only in the last decade or so that Iranian men have seen themselves as the object of desire of a woman. And these, to me, have revolutionized not only the literature, but also the whole society. Social movements in Iran, women's movement in Iran, depending on how you define it, has been given different dates by different scholars. For me, as a scholar of Iranian literature, I think modernity in Iran began congruent with Seneca Falls Convention. You know, that was the beginning of women's movement in the West, in upstate New York. At the same time, in fact, a week before it, we had another convention, similar convention in Iran, where 81 men and 1 woman, also a poet, discussed changing the society. I want to read with you. What is this noise? Okay. This beautiful poem by Tahir Qurratulain. I would explain all my grief, dot by dot, point by point. If heart to heart we talk and face to face we meet. To catch a glimpse of you, I'm wandering like the wind, from house to house, from door to door, from place to place, from street to street. Separated from you, the blood of my heart gushes from my eyes, in torrent after torrent, river after river, in wave upon wave, stream after stream. This afflicted heart of mine has woven your love to the stuff of my life, strand by strand, thread by thread. This is a woman who is using the wind as her vehicle of movement, who is going from street to street, from house to house, in search of the beloved, in search of the person she desires, in search of change and renovation. This notion of flight and captivity is the central trope in women's writing in the last 160 years in Iran. Parvin Ehtesami is another highly celebrated poet in Iran, and you see that she bemoans the fact that women have lived in a cage and died in a cage. Again, imprisonment, entrapment, and all that. The name of this bird in the rose garden was never mentioned. And of course, you know that Iran is known as the land of the rose and the nightingale. I have argued repeatedly that the rose in more than 1,000 years of Persian literature was feminized, like the symbol of femininity. She was held in place and silence. And the nightingale was always masculine. It's the opposite of Western literature, in which nightingales are masculine, are feminine. But in Iran, the land of the rose and the nightingale, rose was feminized and nightingales were masculine. What about the female nightingale? Where is she? Why is she exiled from this garden? Why does the male nightingale sings the beauty of the rose and not that of his companion, the poor female nightingale, who also needs some loving and some recognition? So women have changed that. Women have desegregated the Iranian garden. Farzaneh, the same poet that I started with, who was acknowledged as the counter-ideal woman by the supreme leader, constantly talks about that. Why should I stop, she says. Why should I stop? The birds have gone off to find water waves. The horizon is vertical and moving is rocketing. This is the central theme, the central trope of her poetry. I'm not going to be segregated. I'm not going to keep in my proper place. I'm going to go places. My Bird, this book has actually been translated, and if you're interested in women's writing in Iran, it's a fantastic book. It's a short book, it's 140 pages, and you see the title of the book is My Bird. Again, flight and movement and hope. I want to show you, these are some of the bestsellers in recent years in Iran. Almost all of them with the notion of movement and mobility and birds and going places. Book titles have hopes and change in them. And I want to end with a campaign for 1 million signature in Iran. I'm sure some of you have heard, this is one of the most important grassroots movement that started in Iran in 2007. It was a group of men and women who got together, who decided they're going to go, their motto is street to street, face to face. And I hope you remember, this is a line taken from the poem I just read to you. A woman poet who is banned in Iran, whose poetry cannot be read inside the country, but the most important movement, grassroots movement, egalitarian movement in Iran, gender egalitarian movement in Iran, has adopted a line from a woman poet as their motto. I salute their wisdom. I think there is a reason they have done that. They know women writers have been at the forefront of this modernizing, moderating movement inside their country. And I want to end my presentation with a quotation from a book, Iran Awakening, an autobiography by Shirin Ebadi, the 2003 Peace Laureate, who acknowledges the significance of words and who says, in fact, that's the most important weapons we have at our disposal, not only to change tradition, but also to change the politics and to change the way we are viewed and the way we can change the society in which we live. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Farzaneh. It's most enlightening and very encouraging to hear what you're saying about the Iranian women. I wonder how that can translate into a modernizing and moderating force in other cultures. Can the social media, can Facebook and all these other things get a piece of that so that some changes can take place in others?
Thank you, Jim. This is a great question, and it allows me to talk a little bit about the Arab Spring. I think, at least for a person like me, a student of women in Islam, a student of women in the Middle East, it was delightful to see so many women taking part in the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring had certain fascinating qualities about it. It was generated and in a way revolved around younger generation. It was against rulers that had held on to power for decades, who were not willing to relinquish it. It relied on social media and technology. And I think what has not been discussed enough is the desegregated nature of all these demonstrations in Tahrir Square, in Tunisia, all over the Middle East and North Africa, and of course, the Green Movement in Iran. Please try to remember what you remember of the 1979 revolution. It's probably the image of Ayatollah Khomeini, of a group of men, of large crowds of usually men screaming death to this and that. And now, for a minute, think about what comes to your mind when you think about the Green Movement of 2009. It's Neda Agha Sultan, the woman who was shot. Remember that video tape that went viral? I have heard that no video has been watched more than this short video of a woman being killed by a sniper. The one image I had of all the women wearing green in 2009. For decades, the man of the year on the cover of Newsweek has been Iranian man. You know, it started with Mossadegh in 1953, and the Shah, and then Ayatollah Khomeini for a variety of reasons. And then 2009, we had Person of the Year, and it was a woman. It was Neda Agha Sultan. So not only the role of women and men who helped them has changed the face and the culture of these societies, but their image is also beginning to change in the West. And to me, that's another gift of the Green Revolution, of the Arab Spring, where you see a desegregated society, where you see men and women walking shoulder to shoulder, demanding for their human rights, their human dignity, and for democracy.
Next question, please.
I first wanted to thank you. It was a very enlightening presentation. To me, it's like you were mentioning the veil. You were pulling a veil away for us by focusing on the important role of women, particularly in Iran. And I think from what I've heard and what I know, about the Arab Spring and other events in the Middle East, that the Iranian women particularly are on the forefront of a democratic, quiet movement, and that the Ayatollah Khomeini has rightly recognized the danger that language might pose for his rule or his idea of an Iranian state. Having said that, can you explain why, after the revolution, the participation of women at universities, in parliament, in other events, the reduction of the birth rate, which is probably very worrisome for the leadership, why that happened when we all associate the revolution with oppression and keeping women down and shrouding them? It seems to be a paradox to me.
Thank you very much. And, it's a wonderful question and very eloquently put. And I'm glad you used the word paradox rather than contradiction. It is a paradox. Once we get to know any society that is not our own, we realize that every society has its own paradoxes. If you would allow me, I want to share with you an experience I had. I had the great privilege to be on the ship, a semester at sea, for a semester. We went around the world for a semester, and I visited 14 countries. I and everybody on the ship visited 14 countries in our almost 15 weeks. It was a transformative experience. It was for me, for sure. And I think I saw it in the students and even in some of my colleagues. I was asked at the end by the Dean of Academic Affairs on the ship to give the convocation talk. And it was an honor, and I remember for a few days I was sitting in front of these wonderful, huge windows looking at this gateless ocean, which does something to the psyche. There are no obstacles. The vision is free to go, and it makes you think. And I was thinking about what am I going to say that will wrap up this journey for me, my colleagues, and all the students on the ship. And one of the most important discoveries for me, and I vividly remember when it happened in Cambodia. It was the moment of epiphany for me. Cambodia has this history of execution. One, I think, out of every 4 Cambodians were killed, and we were taken to the killing field, and yet everywhere you go in Cambodia, there is this little temple. They have their little fruits, and even if they can't afford big flowers, they have wild flowers in a little vase. They are the most kind and hospitable and generous people. And I just went to Angkor Wat, and I didn't want to leave that space of serenity and joy. And I remember when we went to the prison where all these thousands of people were executed, it was too much for me. I couldn't understand how to reconcile the killing field with the temples, with Angkor Wat, with the kindness of people. I mean, one ruler could not have killed 1 out of every 4 Cambodians. What happened? I kept asking myself, who were these executioners? And it was then that I realized, once you step beyond stereotypes, once you get to know about other cultures, it becomes paradoxical. There are competing narratives about the culture, about its people, about what has happened in its history, in its culture. So yes, Iran is a land of paradoxes, like all cultures are once you get to know them. But a revolution has happened in Iran in the last 33 years. There are two issues I want to elaborate upon in the wonderful question I was asked. One is the reality of life in Iran. The other one is our perception of that reality in the US. For the last 33 years, Iranians have been held hostage to their own hostage-taking. I will not stand here for a split of a second and justify the hostage crisis. It's not only the Americans who suffered, Iranian people suffered too. And the reaction to that hostage crisis was not uniform. The Prime Minister at the time, Bazargan, resigned because of the hostage crisis. The ambassador of Iran to the United Nations, Mr. Mansour, resigned because of the hostage, objected to what has happened. Iranian writers objected to it. Simin Behbahani, the woman whose few lines of her poems I read to you, she's among many others who wrote about it, who condemned it. So we don't hear about them. The image we have is the image of a group of young radical students who took those hostages. So the hostages are back. I'm delighted, thank God, not a single one of them died. But we, the Iranian people, are still held hostage to that act of hostage-taking of a small minority of our people. The image that, although the Green Movement has started changing that image, but still the prevalent image is that of a group of hostage-takers, of violent people, disrespectful of international laws. We forget that the US is most popular in Iran than in any other Middle Eastern countries. We don't hear about that. We don't hear about the fact that even at the height of the revolution and the hostage crisis, the largest number of Iranians migrated to the US. These were not, according to the US government, these were not typical immigrants to the US. These were some of the most highly educated, some of the richest, most cultured immigrant groups that has ever migrated to this country. We're not talking about people who migrated here for money, to find job. It was out of respect for what the ideals of this country represents. For liberty for all, for justice, for the right of the individual. For the reason I have loved this country and migrated to it way before the revolutions. We don't hear about those things. The prevalent image in the media, in the bestsellers, please remember, the number one bestseller about Iran in this country, ever, nothing comes even close to it, is Not Without My Daughter. A movie was made out of it with Sally Fields. 14 million copies were sold of this book. in which, I'm paraphrasing, but it's written in the book, bomb Iran out of the world map, in which Iranians are presented as a bunch of savage beasts. I'm sure some of you have read the book or seen the movie. That's the most popular book ever published in this country for the last more than 2 decades about Iran. So that's the image, and the media has an important role to play. It's the dominant discourse. I haven't seen it, but I've heard there was an article in New York Times about which country are popular. And I think Canada was the most popular country in the US, followed by UK. And again, I have to say, I haven't seen it yet, that's what I've heard. And Iran has a 9% popularity rate. I think we are even after North Korea. That's the country that has sent some of its best minds and its richest people to this country. You go to Iran, if you read the occasional articles and books written about Americans going to Iran, they all express surprise at how they were welcomed, how they were loved, how they were considered a friend. So one, we should differentiate between the image and the reality that is happening in Iran. 2, you're standing up. I should.
Exactly. This program was inspired by and helped facilitate bringing people like yourself by a noted Persian, Professor Rui Ramazani, and his wife Nesta. And we're all the beneficiaries of that. And I think it's a very excellent point that you make, that we ought to take better recognition of that, not only just for learning about Iran, but about all the cultures in the rest of the world. I appreciate your point. We have a question, please?
Would you just please allow me
Yes, please.
2 minutes? I promise not to be so long, because I really didn't address the exact question that I was asked. Why this flourishing? Why all the statistics that I gave? There are a number of reasons. I think the search for gender equity in Iran goes back to 1848, that important year where the search for gender equity started in the US, in the world, in a way. So there is this long history we cannot forget. Many good things did happen during the Pahlavi regime. They did try a number of things. And things were moving. The clock could not be turned backward. But also, I think the Islamic Republic, that's why I call the collateral benefit. By segregating the space, by dividing the university's classrooms into one section for men, one section for women. Our President Ahmadinejad, when he was the mayor of Tehran, he even segregated elevators in the office of the mayor in Tehran. I'm not justifying it, but I'm saying what it did to a large number of religious families inside the country. It was giving their daughters, their wives, their sisters, the permission to get out of the house and to enter public space. And women did. Women did in large number. We've never had so many women in the public spaces as we do today in Iran. When you go to Iran, you will be surprised by the number of women drivers, women in offices, women in universities, women writers, women painters, women musicians. It is truly a sight you will be surprised to see. And one last thing, the war with Iraq, of course, which happened immediately after the revolution, like what happened in the US. The war lasted 8 years, and when all the men had to go to war, you know what happens. Women by force are drawn into the public space, and that too happened. And these are the major causes. There are lots of other issues too. Sorry to keep you waiting.
You mentioned university life a number of times. You started.
I can't hear you.
You mentioned university life in several times, and in your talk you talked about the change in the gender balance in university students. Could you talk for a few minutes about universities in general in Iran? Are they a progressive force for change? Are they, on the other hand, an extension of the narrow Islamic view expressed by the government? How important are they? How diverse are they? Is that a force for change as well?
That's a great question. Thank you. Let me first preface that for the last 7.5 years, I have not been able to go back to Iran. So what I'm saying is based on reading, on communication with family and friends and artists in Iran. It's not based on a witness account. University, to me, education has consistently been the most important issue. I have studied the veil and written about it for at least 3 decades. I have consistently argued that I am as opposed to the forced unveiling of 1936 as I am to the mandatory veiling of 1983 in Iran. And you know, Reza Shah unveiled women in 1936, and the Islamic Republic revealed them in 1983, although it started earlier, but it took them a while to implement it. And my argument has been, it doesn't matter what the women wear. 1, 2, if you really recognize and respect a woman, it should be her right to decide what she wants to wear. It's a minimum basic human right. The important thing is to allow them their freedom of movement. And the most important thing in that is that they will have access to institutions of higher education. Now, there are many difficult conditions implemented by the regime to allow men and women into universities. They have to pass certain religious tests, and they have to belong to the proper family and all that. But from all the accounts I have personally witnessed, I have read, I have heard, once you get exposed to this boundless world of knowledge, you throw open the gates of your mind and your heart to things that you didn't know. And knowing, it's like me, when I knew more about the Cambodian culture and society, it changed my perspective, not only about my own country, but about my view about the whole world. It made me grow. I think it made me a better global citizen. So education, regardless of what the government wants, has had a salutary effect in Iran among the young students, even from some of the most religious, some of the most pro-regime families. It has been a very positive source of change.
Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This has been a truly eye-opening experience. We thank Professor Farzaneh Milani, and we hope that you'll look at this summer for the videos to replay this and get some of the great insights that she has opened our eyes to today. Next week, we have the continued third in our series, and it'll be Professor William Quant, who's going to give us an update on Egypt, and I'm sure you'll want to get tuned in for that. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
جدا مانده من آسمان تو چه رنگ است امروز آفتابیست هوا یا گرفته است هنوز من در این گوشه که از دنیا بیرون است آسمانی به سرم نیست از بهاران خبرم نیست اندری